All Hit Radio.
Welcome to the X Zone, a place where fact is fiction and fiction is reality. Now, here's your host, Rob McConnell.
Welcome back to the X Zone, everyone. My name is Rob McConnell. We're coming to you from our broadcast center in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Worldwide toll-free, 1-800-610-7035. Email xzone@xzoneradiotv.com. On all social media sites, X-Zone Radio TV, and our website, www.xzoneradiotv.com. It's been nearly 155 years, X-Zone Nation, since Darwin's On the Origin of Species was published, ushering in a new era of how humanity views itself and all life. Now, to explain how evolutionary biology works, scientists have relied upon a premise known as natural selection, which simultaneously accounts for the diversity of life while tracing all species to common ancestry. As sweeping as the evolutionary account is, geophysicist and Discovery Institute's director Stephen C. Meyer says it has always left when significant questions unanswered. For example, how to explain the explosion of biological information that suddenly came into existence during the Cambrian period some 545 million years ago. Well, joining me this hour to help understand is there a missing link in Darwin's theory of evolution is Stephen C. Meyer. He is the director of the Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture and a founder of the Intelligent Design Movement. And Stephen, welcome to the X Zone. Great having you with us. And 155 years ago, it seems just like, a stone thrown into a pond where all this new way of looking at life came around when Darwin came out with the origin of species. But is there anything missing? Does it make sense to you? Is it real?
Well, there's definitely an important event in the history of life that Darwin was unable to explain, and that event is precisely this Cambrian explosion, which is the first appearance of all the major groups of animals, which appear very abruptly in the fossil record. And this puzzled Darwin for two reasons. First of all, it contradicted his understanding of how the process of natural selection needed to work. According to Darwin, natural selection acted on small incremental variations that took a long time to accumulate, and yet what we see in the fossil record is the geologically abrupt appearance of these complex forms of life. And secondly, Darwin depicted the history of life as a gradual branching tree in which complex forms of life should have emerged very gradually from simpler pre-existing forms. And yet again, what we see in the fossil record is this very abrupt and sudden appearance. So on both counts, the Cambrian explosion puzzled Darwin, and he actually wrote about this in the Origin of the Species and said that the Cambrian explosion was a valid objection to the views here entertained, was the way he put it.
So do we really know what happened, how we got here?
Well, there's a lot of unanswered questions in evolutionary theory and evolutionary biology. And what I do in the book Darwin's Doubt is I actually I tell the story of the doubt that Darwin had and show how it's grown up to become illustrative of a much bigger problem in evolutionary biology than even Darwin understood. And part of the reason for that is the continued absence of these ancestral or presumed ancestor fossils in the lower Precambrian strata. But the other reason that the Cambrian explosion has presents such a mystery to contemporary evolutionary theory is that we really don't have an explanation from within standard materialistic evolutionary thinking for the origin of these forms of life, for what caused them to come into existence. And that's become very much more mysterious in the last 50 or 60 years. It's because of everything we've learned about the importance of information, biological information, the digital code that's stored along the spine of the DNA molecule, which we now know is necessary to build the complex proteins and cell types and indeed whole new organisms. So if you want to build a new organism, you've got to have the new code, the instructions. It's just like in the computer world. If you want to give your computer a new function, you've got to give it new code.
That's right.
And so building new animals requires new code, new instructions, and that's the big question. Where does that come from? And how would the Darwinian mechanism of natural selection and random mutation generate all that information?
Exonation, our guest this hour is Stephen C. Meyer. He's the author of Darwin's Doubt, The Explosive Origin of Animal Life and the Case for Intelligent Design. His website is www.darwinsdoubt.com. That's www.darwinsdoubt.com. And Steve and I will be back on the other side of this commercial break as the X Zone continues from our broadcast center in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Exonation, Stephen Meyer is our special guest. He's the author of Darwin's Doubt, The Explosive Origin of Animal Life and the Case for Intelligent Design. His website is www.darwinsdoubt.com. Let me ask you a question, Steve. Why would the average person care whether or not an intelligence is responsible for our existence or a random series of events?
Well, that's a great question. I think the question of biological origins speaks directly to the really deep questions in philosophy and what you might call a person's worldview. It's certainly a question of science. There's no question about that. We're looking at organisms, we're looking at fossils, we're looking at genetics and molecular biology to try to garner the clues we need to make sense of what happened a long time ago. But every worldview has to answer the question: what is the thing or the entity or the process from which everything else came? The issue of origins is critical, and whether you answer that question in strictly materialistic way or if you answer it by reference to some kind of purposive intelligence, that's going to really dictate the kind of worldview you hold. And for the average person, may wonder: is there any purpose to my existence? And if we live in a universe that was the result of purely unguided, undirected processes, the answer to that really ultimately can be no. The only purpose that you have is what you can find during this brief time we're on Earth. But if there's a purpose of intelligence behind everything, there's a possibility that there may indeed be some higher purpose to human existence and some ultimate purpose, perhaps even an afterlife. So the issue of biological origins ends up speaking to these bigger philosophical issues as well as the narrow and very interesting on its own scientific issues.
So are you saying that this flaw in Darwin's theory may actually prove creationism was how it happened, that in 7 days God created the heavens and the earth and everything that we are part of?
Well, I'm arguing for something a little different. It's called the theory of intelligent design. And intelligent design is different than creationism in two ways. Creationism is based on a particular interpretation of the biblical text, and specifically the idea that the days of Genesis are literal 24-hour periods, and therefore the age of the earth is very, very young. And it's but the theory of intelligent design isn't taking a position on the question of the age of the Earth. I myself think that the Earth is very, very old, billions of years. And secondly, the theory of intelligent design is based on scientific evidence. It's an inference from the biological evidence, not an interpretation or a deduction from a scriptural text, but something very different than creationism. But I do think there's evidence for a designing intelligence playing a role in the history of life. And if you come to that view, that's certainly consistent with a broadly theistic perspective on the world.
Are there biologists and other scientists, professors, and philosophers who actually agree with you?
Oh, very many. The institute that has our program, the Discovery Institute, has a number of scientists directly affiliated who are physicists, biologists, historians and philosophers of science, and there are many scientists around the world who are sympathetic to the views that we're developing. So this is a scientific-based research program. At our institute, there's a quite prominent biologist who used to be at the Smithsonian Institution, named Richard Sternberg, and in 2004, he was editing a journal called The Proceedings of the Biological Society of Washington. It's something published out of the Smithsonian Institution, and he published a paper that I had written, which was actually a prelude to the book that we're discussing. And Sternberg found that after allowing the publication to go through peer review, that he was very aggressively persecuted within the university, or within the institution. They took away his office and his keys and his access to scientific samples.
Wow.
And there was even a disinformation campaign waged against him, a congressional hearing that ended up investigating his case, found that in the email trail there were people in the museum were intentionally spreading false rumors against him. He had there were claims that he didn't have a PhD in biology. He has 2 earned PhDs, including one in evolutionary biology, that he was a priest, that he was working for the Bush campaign, all kinds of things. And in the end, he was demoted, and now he's working with us. And there are many such scientists who have found that by questioning Darwinian theory and even allowing, and Sternberg wasn't advocating intelligent design at the time. He was just allowing an article to be published exploring the idea. Many scientists have found that they've come into this kind of opposition, and so increasingly these scientists who have been dissenting from Darwinian orthodoxy are finding each other, and it's created a kind of international network of scientists from many countries. There's a very prominent Brazilian scientist, Marcos Eberlin, who's on the editorial board for the new journal Biocomplexity, and he's a member of the Brazilian Academy of Sciences. He's got 400 peer-reviewed publications, and he's a staunch advocate of intelligent design. So this is a worldwide scientific research community, and it's growing, and it's, I think, a very exciting development in science, because what it's creating is a genuine competition of ideas within biology about how we got here. And the way you framed it before was exactly right. There's 2 possibilities. Either life is the result of an undirected, unguided, and strictly materialistic process, a mindless process, or a mind of some kind played a role. And we think that we're advocating the latter view, and we think that the evidence supports that view.
You know what I can't understand is why, when scientists like your colleague who used to be at the Smithsonian comes up with a finding that may go against academia, why they're persecuted. Isn't it my understanding of science is that you go, you investigate, you report what your findings are. So why should he
follow the evidence?
Yeah,
exactly. You follow the evidence where it leads. That's what scientists are committed to doing in principle. But
Right.
of course, scientists are human beings. We all have our biases, and one of the things about the origins issue that's maybe even unique among scientific controversies, and there are controversies in science, and scientists argue among themselves about how to interpret the evidence, and when science is working well, those arguments proceed freely. But there are many cases where a minority view is marginalized or stigmatized, maybe unfairly, and then later vindicates itself. But this issue of biological origins, I think, is especially sensitive because of these larger philosophical issues that we were talking about earlier. I have a friendly debating partner who's a staunch Darwinist himself. His name is Michael Ruse. He used to be at the University of Guelph in Canada. And Ruse has written an important book in which he explains that Darwinism, or the modern form of Darwinism called neo-Darwinism, has functioned as a kind of secular religion for many scientists. And many scientists are almost unaware of the way in which Darwin's theory provides a kind of secular creation story for them. So when there is scientific evidence that's brought against the theory and challenge to the theory, oftentimes scientific defenders of the theory react like anyone else would when their fundamental belief system is being challenged. And it makes this debate a little bit more tense and sometimes emotional than other scientific debates, precisely because there's so much at stake philosophically.
Well, I can use an example that I've used many times before, Steve, is that we know for a fact Christopher Columbus did not discover the Americas, and yet historians refuse to make any changes in the educational system that says otherwise. Books are being printed today that are in schools today that Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas. So if it works that way in history, I never thought it would be like that in science, though.
Well, it might be a human nature thing. We get wedded to one particular way of looking at things, and especially when there's a perception that there's a consensus. Whether there's a consensus or not, the perception of a consensus will often cause people to want to conform to what everybody else is thinking, and there's always a kind of social stigma in proposing a radical new idea that some it's difficult to stand firm when you think you've got good reasons for proposing a radical new idea. But I think what's encouraging about this, the challenge that's being made to Darwinian thought in contemporary times, is that this is an idea that is 150 plus years old, and even the modern version of Darwinism dates from the 1930s, and we have learned a lot about genetics and DNA and molecular biology and developmental biology and the fossil record in that period of time. And while Darwin's theory explains a number of things very well, in particular the small-scale variations that we observe, like the famous peppered moth in England, in which the population went from dark to light to dark color over time, or the Galapagos finches in South America, where the beaks change shape and size in response to varying weather patterns. Those kinds of variations, a small-scale evolution is well documented, and Darwin's theory, I think most scientists believe, explains that well. But where you have an increasing number of scientists expressing skepticism concerns the ability of natural selection and mutation to generate the large-scale innovations in the history of life when we see fundamentally new things arising in the fossil record. So one evolutionary biologist has put it this way. He says that natural selection explains the survival but not the arrival of the fittest. The small stuff, but not the big stuff.
Very interesting. Tell me, now this may sound far out to you, but I'm going to ask you the question anyway. Is it possible that our origins actually come from the stars? There's a lot of people who believe that life here on this planet originated on another planet and was actually brought here by space travelers. Is that possible?
Well, I'm not a proponent of that idea myself.
Okay.
I think it kind of pushes the question back one generation and then leaves it unanswered all over again. But there have been some scientists who have proposed that. One, no less a figure than Francis Crick, proposed that in a little book in 1980 called Life Itself. And It wasn't clear whether he was doing this in jest or, more with tongue-in-cheek, or whether he was really serious. But there was a reason that he proposed this, and that is that what's called the prebiotic environment on planet Earth is actually was not, based on what we know from geochemistry, favorable to the formation of the crucial molecules that life needs to survive. And so he said, well, maybe some other environment in outer space is the place where it happened.
Steve,
and this is known as the theory of panspermia.
Steve, stand by. We've got to take our news break at the bottom of the hour. This is a fascinating topic. Thanks very much for joining us. I'm really having a good time with this topic. Exonation, Steve Meyer is our special guest. www.darwinsdoubt.com. The name of his book is Darwin's Doubt, The Explosive Origin of Animal Life and the Case for Intelligent Design. We'll be back on the other side of this news break. Don't go away. And welcome back, everyone. Stephen Meyer is our special guest this hour. He's the author of Darwin's Doubt, The Explosive Origin of Animal Life and the Case for Intelligent Design. And his website is www.darwinsdoubt.com. Steve, you and I were talking during the commercial break in the news, and we were just discussing the different venues and the different people that have come on the show and their theories. And I've often talked about my friend Dr. Seth Shostak from SETI, and there are parallels between what SETI is doing and what you're doing.
Well, right. The argument that I'm making for intelligent design is based on the importance of information to all biological systems. And the big discovery, really, that started in the 1950s And a little background on this: in the 1950s, Watson and Crick famously discovered the structure of the DNA molecule in 1953. But in 1957, Francis Crick, who was a code breaker in World War II, by the way, put forward a hypothesis that is really a stop-press moment in the history of biology. It was called the sequence hypothesis. And what Crick realized was that there are 4 chemicals running along the interior spine of the DNA molecule, and the chemicals are called bases. And he proposed that these 4 chemicals are functioning like alphabetic characters in a written language or digital characters in a section of software or machine code. That is to say, it's the precise arrangement of these chemicals, not their physical or chemical properties, that allows the DNA to perform the function that it does. And the function that DNA performs is that it provides instructions for building the protein and protein machines that cells need to stay alive. So you literally have digital code directing the construction of mechanical parts inside cells. Now, that means that DNA is an information-bearing molecule. It's information-rich, and the information is stored in an alphabetic or digital form. Now, the people that are looking for extraterrestrial intelligence, the SETI scientists, are actually looking for information embedded in a radio signal. And if they find a signal that isn't just a random noise or just a repeating series of pulses, but something that has the signature of information, they will conclude that they have found evidence of intelligence in space. Information is a positive indicator of prior intelligent activity. And you may remember in the Contact film that
with Jodie Foster,
yeah, with Jodie Foster, based on the Carl Sagan novel.
Yep.
There's a point in the film where Jodie Foster realizes they're not just getting a repetitive pulse, or they're not getting random noise. They're getting a series of prime numbers, and that's information-rich sequence. And they realize there must be an intelligence behind it. Now that's science fiction. Nobody working on SETI has yet found the information-rich structures that would justify inferring that there was an intelligent source. But in biology, in every cell of every living organism, there is a molecule, DNA, that does have information embedded in it in just the way that we'd be looking for it in outer space. And so the natural inference is that the information in DNA has an intelligent source. In fact, information always arises from an intelligent source. This is something that we know from our uniform and repeated experience, whether we're looking at a hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book or a section of software code or information embedded in a radio signal. Whenever we find information and trace it back to its ultimate source, we always come to a mind, not a material process. So the discovery of information at the foundation of life and these big infusions of information that happen in the history of life, in events like the Cambrian explosion, are, I argue, decisive indicators of prior intelligent activity in the history of life.
One point that I always bring up to Seth whenever I have the opportunity of speaking to him is what happens if you're listening to the wrong signal? What happens if you're going from frequency A to B, let's say A to Z, and the transmission you're seeking isn't on A to Z, but it's on from 1 to 0? Like, how do you know that the advanced civilizations will be transmitting in a message that you can understand with our present-day technology?
Well, I guess that's a really good question for the SETI people. I think the assumption, as made in the Contact film at least, was that an intelligence from space would send something in a universally recognized language, which was, in this case they assumed mathematics. Again, I'd emphasize that no such information-bearing signal has been detected in all of our scanning of the heavens, but right in front of us in living systems we have one of the distinctive hallmarks of intelligent activity, which is digital code.
And that's what's so exciting about what you're doing.
Yeah, I think that's what the revolution in molecular biology. I think what has revived this interest in design. I mean, the concept of design, the design hypothesis, the design argument, has a very ancient pedigree in Western thought. It goes back to the Greeks, the Romans, like Cicero made design arguments, the medievals, Isaac Newton made them right in his most important works of physics. But with Darwin's theory, the idea of design was kind of put on the shelf. And Darwin was explicitly trying to explain the appearance of design in living organisms without reference to an actual designing intelligence. That was the whole idea of natural selection. He thought it was an undirected, unguided process that could mimic the powers of a designing intelligence without itself being guided or directed in any way. And thus you have modern neo-Darwinists like Richard Dawkins, the famed spokesman for Darwinian thought from Oxford University, who says that biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. It's classical Darwinian thinking. Design, the appearance of design without an actual designer. And what we're doing with the formulation of this new theory of intelligent design is to say, no, there are some things in biological systems that not only give the appearance of design, but actually are best explained by a real intelligent designer. And digital code and the information processing system in, systems in cells and the circuitry that you find in developing animals, genetic circuitry, there's some extraordinarily high-tech systems within biological organisms that have all the distinctive hallmarks of things that are designed by intelligent agents, even by engineers. And so the Darwinian idea that we're looking at just the illusion of design, I think, is much less credible than it was in the 19th century.
Fascinating. I've heard theories where there are certain aspects of our intelligent design that are just turning on now. Have you seen any evidence of this?
Well, what we're seeing, I think, in particular, is we're discovering a lot of things in biological systems that are making us that we couldn't have appreciated until we got to a certain point in the development of our own technology.
Right.
I had an experience while I was working on my first book, Signature in the Cell, which is about the origin of the first life, where we had a Microsoft programmer working for us. He was one of their elite architect-level programmers who had retired, which means I think he was 38 or something. And you know how retirement works out in Redmond, Washington. So anyway, he was writing code for us to help us simulate what's called the gene expression system, how the digital information in DNA directs the construction of these proteins and protein machines. One day he walks into my office. He throws a book on my desk called Design Patterns, which is apparently a standard manual for computer design engineers. And he pointed to the book and he said, I get an eerie feeling that someone figured all this out before us. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, I'm writing all this code to simulate how the information in DNA produces all these intricate structures. And what I'm discovering is I'm learning the molecular biology so I can write the code to simulate what's going on, is that there are all kinds of design patterns already at work in molecular biology. And then he went on to explain that a design pattern is an established design strategy for solving certain problems, particularly problems in information storage and processing. And then he went on to tick off all the things that the cell does, that all the design strategies that the cell has that are used in modern high-tech digital computing. He said we have a spell check in our word processing systems. Yeah. There's an automated error correction in the processing of the information in DNA. In cryptography, we will often embed one message in another message in order to conceal it. In DNA, we have genes embedded in other genes. We have it's called nested coding of information. And he went off and ticked off a half a dozen of these very sophisticated strategies for processing and storing digital information. And then he went on to say, the parallels are striking except for one thing. The information in DNA is being processed with an 8.0, 9.0, 10.0 efficiency, well beyond anything that we've ever achieved ourselves. There's an elegance in design that supersedes our own. And it was kind of an unforgettable conversation to see a really frontline computer scientist engaging the biology and seeing these connections between the two forms of technology.
Well, let me ask you this. Is it possible then that we living forms on this planet are advanced hybrid computers?
Well, I don't think we are computers, but I think we contain technologies that are reminiscent of computers. And our local hero out here in Seattle, Bill Gates, says that DNA is like a software program, only much more advanced than any we've ever created. And that's a very suggestive remark, because we know that computer programs come from programmers.
That's right.
And we know that information generally comes from an intelligent source. So the discovery of information at the foundation of life, again, I think points to an intelligence. Some people, living cells also have machines in them. They're little tiny miniaturized machines. It's nanotechnology.
Yes.
Walking motor proteins and sliding clamps and rotary engines and all kinds of sophisticated nanotechnology. I don't think that means that we are machines, but I think we contain machines. I don't think we are computer code, but we contain digital code. There's much more to life than just the constituent parts, but I think the constituent parts have a sophistication of design and integrated complexity that points to a designing intelligence as their ultimate origin.
So if you were looking, let's go back in time. Let's use Mr. Peabody's Wayback Machine. And we go back.
I remember that.
Yeah.
We're dating ourselves from the cartoons.
It's, you know what, the cartoons in childhood make a lot of sense to me these days.
They sure do.
So we go back in time in the Wayback Machine to the days of the authoring of the Bible. I often wonder if the events that happened way back then happened today, if they would be so mysterious, if they would have been so shocking to the point where we gave a deity, who for all we know may have been the masters and responsible for this intelligent design that we're talking about this hour, the recognition of gods. And maybe that's why in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, it says, and God said, let us create man in our own image, our own likeness. Maybe they're talking about the DNA and the intelligent design.
Well, one of the interesting concepts, I think, biblically, is the idea that in the beginning was the Word. Yeah. And the idea, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, that the physical world came from an idea in the mind of God, which was expressed oddly as a form of information. Mm-hmm. And the theory of intelligent design, as I mentioned, is not based on the scriptural text.
Oh, I understand that.
Once you've concluded that there's a design intelligence of some kind, it does seem to raise a bigger question about who the intelligence is.
Exactly.
And we discussed, well, maybe it's an intelligence within the cosmos, some sort of space alien or something. I've always favored the more theistic view that points to a transcendent form of intelligence, in part because the design in biology is so much more elegant and sophisticated than anything we've achieved, but also because there's evidence of design in physics that you find in the very fabric of the laws of physics themselves. The physicists have been talking since the 1960s about this extraordinary phenomenon called fine-tuning, where the laws of physics themselves seem to be delicately balanced to allow for the possibility of life. We live in a kind of Goldilocks universe where the strength of fundamental forces are not too strong, not too weak. The expansion rate of the universe is not too fast, too slow. Everything is balanced on a hair's breadth to allow for the possibility of life. And this fine-tuning, I think, points to, again, to an intelligence of some kind, to a fine-tuner. But in this case, I don't think the intelligence responsible could possibly have been an agent within the cosmos, because no agent within the cosmos can explain the laws of physics themselves as they apply to every agent within the cosmos. This seems to point to a transcendent form of intelligence. And so I think with when we take the evidence from biology, from physics, certainly from cosmology with the idea of the Big Bang, I think we're looking at something that has a collection of evidences that I think taken together have frankly theistic implications.
Steve, stand by. We've got to take our final break. Great hour. Exonation, Steve Meyer is our special guest this hour, and he is the author of, do you have your pencils ready? Darwin's Doubt, The Explosive Origin of Animal Life and the Case for Intelligent Design. His website is www.darwinsdoubt.com. We'll be back on the other side of this short break. Don't go away. Exonation, my guest this hour is Stephen C. Meyer. We've been talking to Stephen about his book entitled Darwin's Doubt, The Explosive Origin of Animal Life and the Case for Intelligent Design. www.darwinsdoubt.com. It's available in paperback now. There's been a new added chapter that extensively responds to various reactions within the scientific community. His book is available in all major bookstores as well as all online major bookstores. This, my friends, is a must because this book just kind of brings everything together that we've talked about here over the last 22 years. You know, fact is stranger than fiction, Stephen, and I think that you have been doing a great job of presenting that over the past hour, which, by the way, has gone by so fast. How close are we to knowing what our true origins are?
Well, I think what we get are some interesting glimmers. And there was a book by a famous sociologist, Peter Berger, a few years ago, and it was he had a chapter entitled Rumors of Angels. And we've lived for the last 150 years or more, really, since the late 19th century. I think our academic institutions, our scientific communities have been very influenced by a philosophy called materialism, which says that matter and energy are the thing from which everything else came. And so there are a lot of surprising things being discovered today in science that are surprising because of the materialistic sensibilities of people in the scientific community. We've inherited an outlook, a philosophy that is really too narrow. It's closing us off to aspects of reality. And every once in a while, we're getting rumors of something beyond the material realm breaking into our awareness. And I think the discovery of the information-bearing properties of DNA was just one such discovery. When you encounter code, when you encounter systems of communication, you know that there are communicators or agents behind that. One illustration I used in my first book, Signature in the Cell, was imagine you're an explorer on a remote, uncharted island, and you come into a cave, and you find all kinds of markings on the cave wall, and after you stay for a while and you start to make sense of the markings, and you realize, no, this is a form of communication. You're not going to infer that wind and erosion or tidal action produce those inscriptions. You're going to say there was a person here before me. Yeah. And in fact, we've made exactly that kind of inference in archaeology all the time. The Rosetta Stone, which sits in the British Museum, is a perfect example of an artifact which was discovered that led the scientists to conclude that there was a who rather than just a what that was responsible for it. They concluded that a scribe had written those passages in the three different languages. And so information, I think, is a distinctive hallmark of intelligence. It doesn't fit with the traditional materialistic view, which wants to explain everything by reference to matter and energy alone. But what we're learning in the 20th and 21st century is that there's a third fundamental aspect of reality. That aspect is information, and everything we know from our uniform and repeated experience, which is the basis of all scientific reasoning, is that information comes from a mind. And so we have to open our own minds up to the reality of intelligence or mind. It's something that may defy the material philosophy, but there it is.
Steve, I hate to do this, but we're out of time for tonight. I've given you an open invitation. Anytime you'd like to come back, my friend, please let me know. Thank you so much for your great work. Thank you for being with us tonight, and I wish you much success.
Hey, and thank you for the great conversation and questions. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you, Steve. Exonation Stephen Meyer has been our guest. www.darwinsdoubt.com. I'll be back on the other side of the news at 6.5 minutes past the hour as we continue here in the X Zone. Don't go away.